Sometimes the most powerful person in the kingdom isn't the one wearing the crown. When King Edmund decided to make an example of a simple peasant who dared to speak against royal taxes, he thought it would be just another execution to maintain his authority. But what happened when the crowd gathered in that courtyard? What the people did when they saw true injustice changed the course of an entire kingdom forever. If you love stories of courage, justice, and unexpected plot twists, make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell, because we bring you the most incredible medieval tales every day. This is a story about the moment when power met its match, when a king learned that some things are more powerful than royal decrees, and when one peasant's courage sparked a revolution that no one saw coming. Stay until the end, because what the crowd did next will give you chills and restore your faith in humanity. The morning sun painted golden hues across the ancient stones of the royal courtyard when King Edmund ascended the ornate portable throne prepared especially for this execution. His cold, calculating eyes swept across the crowd already gathering in the shadows of the towering castle walls, weathered peasants and nervous merchants who had abandoned their daily labors to witness what promised to be a definitive demonstration of absolute royal power. The monarch adjusted the heavy jeweled crown upon his graying head, each deliberate gesture meticulously calculated to inspire both fear and unquestioning respect among his subjects. The courtyard itself bore witness to centuries of royal justice, its cobblestones worn smooth by countless feet of those who had come to watch the king's will be done. Towering stone walls rose on all sides, their surfaces adorned with the heraldic banners of noble houses, while narrow windows looked down like judgmental eyes from the castle's upper floors. The air carried the scent of morning dew mixed with the metallic tang of fear that always preceded executions. "Bring forth the criminal," Edmund commanded with a voice that echoed off the castle's ancient stone walls like thunder rolling across mountains. His words carried the weight of absolute authority, the kind of power that had been passed down through generations of monarchs who believed themselves appointed by divine will. 2 royal guards in gleaming chainmail emerged from the darkness of the dungeon entrance, their heavy boots echoing against stone as they escorted a man who walked with surprising dignity for someone who would face death in mere minutes. Thomas of Millbrook, the village blacksmith of only 28 years, kept his head held high despite the heavy iron chains that weighed upon his calloused wrists and ankles. His simple brown tunic was stained with soot from his forge, and his hands bore the permanent marks of honest labor, burns from hot metal, calluses from gripping hammer handles, scars that spoke of a life spent creating tools that helped his community survive. There was something in his bearing, a quiet strength that seemed to grow rather than diminish as he approached what should have been his final moments. Thomas's so-called crime was devastatingly simple in the king's narrow interpretation. He had dared to publicly question the crushing tax burden that was systematically driving families throughout the kingdom to the very brink of starvation. "Why must we surrender half our meager bread when the royal granaries overflow with grain that rots unused?" he had asked in the market square just 3 days prior, his words finding immediate echo in dozens of weary, desperate hearts. The question had spread through the village like wildfire, whispered in homes where children cried themselves to sleep from hunger. To King Edmund, this constituted not merely dissent, but treason of the highest and most dangerous order, a direct, unforgivable challenge to the divine authority that he believed God himself had bestowed upon the royal bloodline. In the king's mind, to question royal policy was to question God's will, an offense that demanded the ultimate punishment to serve as a warning to any others who might harbor similar rebellious thoughts. The executioner, a massive man known throughout the kingdom simply as the Reaper, stood motionless beside the scarred wooden execution block, his enormous double-headed axe gleaming with deadly promise in the strengthening morning light. The crowd pressed closer despite their fear, a mixture of morbid curiosity and growing unease rippling through their tightly packed ranks like stones thrown into still water. Young children clung desperately to their mothers' worn skirts while elderly men muttered half-remembered prayers under their labored breath, their eyes fixed on the terrible scene unfolding before them. "Thomas of Millbrook," the king's voice boomed across the stone courtyard with the force of divine proclamation, "you stand accused of sedition against the crown, of deliberately spreading dangerous discontent among our loyal subjects, and of blasphemously questioning the sacred divine right that God himself has bestowed upon our royal person. The formal charges hung heavy in the morning air like storm clouds gathering before a devastating tempest, each word carefully chosen to paint the condemned man as an enemy of both earthly and heavenly authority. The condemned blacksmith raised his weathered head, his face bearing the permanent marks of honest labor and genuine hardship etched by years of working over blazing forges and supporting his struggling community. "Your Majesty," he said, his voice carrying clearly across the courtyard despite the weight of iron chains, "I spoke only what every desperate father here knows in his breaking heart, that watching our innocent children grow dangerously thin while gold accumulates uselessly in royal vaults is a pain no loving parent should ever be forced to endure." His words struck the assembled crowd like lightning, illuminating a dark landscape. A murmur ran through the gathered people like wind rushing through ripening wheat fields, carrying with it the recognition of shared suffering and common truth. Several women openly wiped tears from their careworn faces, while hard-working men clenched their calloused fists at their sides, their jaws tight with suppressed emotion. The king's own jaw visibly tightened as he realized that even while facing imminent death, this simple peasant dared to continue speaking his dangerous truth. King Edmund rose from his ornate throne, his heavy royal robes rustling like the wings of a great predatory bird preparing to strike. "Your treasonous words only serve to confirm your overwhelming guilt," he declared with growing fury, pointing an accusatory finger directly at Thomas's chest. "A truly loyal subject does not question his sovereign's divine wisdom. A faithful man trusts completely that his anointed king knows what is best for the entire realm." His voice carried all the arrogance of a man who had never known the gnawing pain of hunger, never felt the desperate weight of choosing between paying crushing taxes and feeding his starving family. The crowd shifted restlessly in the confined space, and for the first time in his reign, Edmund noticed something deeply troubling in their collective expressions. Where he had always expected to see the usual fear and immediate submission to royal authority, he found something else entirely, a quiet but unmistakable solidarity, a shared recognition of fundamental injustice that made his skin crawl with genuine unease. Thomas smiled sadly as his knowing eyes moved across the familiar faces surrounding him in the courtyard. "I see my beloved neighbors gathered here," he said, his voice somehow managing to reach every corner of the stone-walled space despite speaking in measured, gentle tones. "I see Margaret the baker, whose precious flour supplies are nearly exhausted. I see William the weaver, whose innocent children cry themselves to sleep each night from the sharp pain of hunger. I see Robert the carpenter, who was forced to sell his essential tools just to pay the king's ever-increasing taxes." Each carefully chosen word hit the crowd like smooth stones thrown into perfectly still water, creating expanding ripples of recognition and barely suppressed anger. "Silence!" Edmund roared, his pale face flushing deep red with uncontrolled fury. "You will not turn my faithful subjects against me with your poisonous, rebellious words." But even as the commanding words left his mouth, he could clearly see the profound effect Thomas was having on every person present. Heads were nodding slowly in agreement, eyes were filling with tears of painful recognition, and a dangerous energy was building steadily in the crowd like pressure in a sealed vessel. Margaret the baker stepped forward from the crowd, her flour-dusted apron telling the story of a woman who worked from dawn to dusk just to survive. Her voice trembled with emotion but carried clearly across the stone courtyard. "He speaks nothing but the painful truth, Your Majesty. My precious children haven't tasted proper bread in weeks because I cannot afford the grain after paying your crushing taxes." Her heartbreaking confession broke something fundamental open in the courtyard, and suddenly other voices began joining hers in a chorus of shared suffering. "My beloved wife died from fever this past winter because I couldn't afford the healer's fee after paying your taxes," called out David the cobbler, his voice cracking with grief that still felt fresh and raw. "The medicine she desperately needed cost less than what you spend on fine wine in a single day of feasting." His words carried the weight of personal tragedy, and several people in the crowd nodded in recognition of similar losses. "My eldest son was forced to join the bandits hiding in the dark forest because there was no honest work left in this kingdom that could feed a growing family," added Elena the seamstress, her voice breaking with shame and heartbreak. "A good boy," raised with love and proper values, driven to crime by your policies. Tears streamed down her weathered cheeks as she spoke of a mother's ultimate failure, being unable to provide for her child. One by one, like dam bursting under overwhelming pressure, the people began sharing their stories of hardship and desperation, their voices growing progressively stronger as they realized they were not alone in their suffering. Each testimony was a thread in a tapestry of injustice that had been hidden for too long. The king watched in growing alarm and confusion as his carefully planned execution was transforming into something he had never anticipated or prepared for, a public trial of his own rule and policies. The massive executioner looked uncertainly between his commanding king and the growing unrest rippling through the crowd like waves on a storm-tossed sea. His enormous hands gripped the polished axe handle tighter, but for the first time in his long and brutal career, he found himself hesitating. These weren't foreign enemies or dangerous criminals deserving of death. These were his own people, his neighbors, sharing truths that he himself lived with every single day. The atmosphere in the ancient courtyard began to shift dramatically, like weather changing before a violent storm. What had started as a typical royal execution was becoming something unprecedented in the kingdom's long and storied history. Thomas remained kneeling by the scarred execution block, but his presence seemed to grow larger and more significant with each passing moment, not smaller as the king had intended. The heavy iron chains on his wrists appeared almost ceremonial now, as if he were a willing martyr preparing for sainthood rather than a condemned criminal awaiting death. Enough of this theatrical rebellion. King Edmund's voice cracked like a whip across the courtyard, but the sound seemed to carry less authority than before, as if the very air had somehow changed its allegiance. I will not allow this circus of sedition to continue poisoning my subjects. Executioner, do your sworn duty immediately. His commands echoed off the stone walls with desperate urgency, but they seemed to fall on increasingly deaf ears. But the executioner, known throughout the entire kingdom for his unwavering obedience to royal commands and his efficient dispatch of the condemned, found himself completely frozen in place. The massive man, who had carried out dozens of executions without a moment's hesitation or doubt, stood staring at the crowd with something approaching wonder and revelation. He had never witnessed anything like this extraordinary scene, an entire community finding its collective voice through the moral courage of one simple man. Father Benedict, the elderly priest who had served this community faithfully for over 30 years, pushed through the crowd until he stood just feet from the king's throne. His weathered face bore the wisdom of decades spent comforting the dying and counseling the desperate in their darkest hours. Your Majesty, he said solemnly, his voice carrying the weight of moral authority that even kings were expected to respect, there comes a sacred time when earthly law must yield to divine justice, when human authority must bow before God's commandment to show mercy to the suffering. An elderly woman, her back permanently bent from decades of back-breaking labor in the fields, pushed determinedly through the crowd until she stood mere feet from the king's ornate throne. Her weathered hands trembled not with fear, but with the righteous anger of someone who had lived long enough to recognize true injustice when she saw it. Your Majesty, she said, her voice quavering with advanced age but remarkably strong with unshakable conviction, Thomas helped repair my leaking roof last winter when the cruel winds threatened to collapse it entirely, asking absolutely nothing in return for his labor. He shared his own family's meager soup with my starving grandchildren when they were crying from hunger, giving from his own mouth to feed theirs. She paused, gathering courage for words that could cost her life. This man you condemn as a dangerous criminal has shown more genuine kindness to your suffering subjects than... She stopped herself just short of completing the devastating comparison, but the implication hung heavy in the courtyard air like sacred incense, impossible to ignore or dismiss. The king's eyes blazed with uncontrolled fury at the unspoken accusation. How dare you compare me to this common peasant? He roared, spittle flying from his lips in his rage. But even as the angry words left his mouth, more people were stepping forward courageously from the crowd, each carrying their own story of Thomas's extraordinary generosity and moral character. Young Peter, the farmer's earnest son of barely 16 years, spoke up with the clear voice of youth unburdened by fear. When the terrible spring floods destroyed all our crops and threatened our family with starvation, Thomas worked in our muddy fields from dawn to dusk for weeks, asking for no payment, helping us plant again when we had lost all hope. He said a true community must always care for its own, especially in times of greatest need. His young voice carried clearly in the increasingly charged atmosphere, and many heads nodded in recognition of similar acts of kindness. He taught my boy the intricate blacksmith's trade when we couldn't afford to pay a proper master for training, added William the merchant, his voice thick with gratitude. Said every child in the kingdom deserves a fair chance to learn an honest profession that can support a family. The crowd murmured approvingly at this story of selfless generosity toward the next generation. The testimonies kept flowing like water breaking through a dam, each one painting a progressively clearer picture of a man who truly lived his deeply held values, who consistently put community welfare before personal gain, who embodied the very virtues of charity and justice that the nobility constantly claimed to represent but rarely demonstrated. With each heartfelt testimony, Thomas seemed to grow in moral stature and authority while the king appeared to diminish and shrink before their eyes. King Edmund looked around desperately, frantically seeking support from his assembled courtiers and loyal guards, but found only uncomfortable silence and averted gazes. Even his own men, trained from birth to follow royal commands without question, were listening to these powerful stories with something approaching reverence and recognition. The execution that was specifically designed to demonstrate his absolute power over life and death was revealing something far more dangerous to royal authority: the undeniable power of moral leadership over mere brute force. Thomas finally spoke again, his calm voice carrying easily across the now silent courtyard like a bell tolling across still water. "Your Majesty, I want you to know that I do not fear death itself. But I deeply fear for a kingdom where speaking obvious truth becomes treason, where showing basic compassion is branded as dangerous rebellion, where simply asking for elementary justice is answered with the executioner's axe." His words fell upon the crowd like seeds on fertile ground, taking root in hearts already prepared by suffering to receive them. The priest's weathered face showed the accumulated wisdom of decades spent ministering to the poor and desperate. "If questioning the morality of allowing innocent children to starve while royal granaries overflow with unused grain constitutes treason in your eyes, Your Majesty, then we must seriously ask ourselves what kind of kingdom we have allowed ourselves to become." Thomas's profound words hit the assembled courtyard like lightning, illuminating truths that had been deliberately hidden in shadow for far too long. The crowd had grown exponentially larger as urgent word of this most unusual execution spread rapidly through the town and surrounding villages, and now hundreds upon hundreds of people pressed desperately into the confined space, their weathered faces reflecting a powerful mixture of raw grief, righteous anger, and something far more dangerous to established royal authority: the dangerous flame of genuine hope. Young Sarah, barely 16 years old and visibly heavy with child, pushed determinedly through the dense crowd until she stood directly near Thomas, her youth making her courage all the more remarkable. "When my beloved husband died fighting in your distant war, Your Majesty," she said, her clear voice cutting through the tension despite the tears streaming down her pale cheeks, "Thomas made absolutely certain that I had sufficient firewood to survive the brutal winter months ahead. He said no woman should ever be forced to freeze while carrying precious new life within her body." She placed a fiercely protective hand over her swollen belly, her gesture speaking volumes about maternal love and the community support that had kept her alive. "This child will grow up knowing that true kindness and compassion exist in this world, because Thomas showed it to me when I had nowhere else to turn." The massive executioner, still standing rigidly beside the blood-stained block with his enormous axe raised high above his head, began to tremble visibly. Not from fear or physical weakness, but from the overwhelming moral weight of what he was being commanded to do by his king. Throughout his long and brutal career, he had efficiently executed foreign spies, cold-blooded murderers, and dangerous thieves without a moment's hesitation or doubt about the justice of his actions. But this gentle man, now surrounded by an ever-growing chorus of testimonies praising his kindness and selfless mercy, seemed to represent something fundamentally sacred that even a professional killer found impossible to destroy. King Edmund witnessed the obvious hesitation in his executioner's previously unwavering stance, and felt his absolute authority slipping away like fine sand through desperately clenched fingers. "I command you to carry out this execution immediately," he shouted with growing desperation, his voice cracking like thin ice under pressure, rather than carrying its usual tone of unquestionable authority. The crowd's response was immediate, unanimous, and utterly startling in its defiance. Instead of the fearful, submissive silence that had always met royal commands throughout living memory, hundreds of voices rose as one in a thunderous chorus that shook the very foundations of royal power. No. The single word echoed and re-echoed off the ancient castle walls like a battle cry from the heavens themselves, reverberating through stone and flesh with equal devastating power. Never in the entire recorded history of the kingdom had a direct royal command been so boldly, so unanimously refused by the common people. The sound sent visible shivers down the spines of nobles and peasants alike, for absolutely everyone present understood instinctively that they were witnessing something that would forever and irrevocably change the fundamental relationship between ruler and ruled. King Edmund physically staggered backward as if struck by an invisible but powerful blow. His pale face cycled rapidly through a rainbow of intense emotions, uncontrolled rage, complete disbelief, genuine fear, and something approaching pure panic. "You dare defy your anointed king," he gasped, his voice barely audible above the rising murmur of the increasingly bold crowd. "This is treason. High treason against the crown. All of you. Guards, arrest every single one of them immediately." But when he turned desperately to his loyal guards for the support he had always taken for granted, he found only uncertain, troubled faces staring back at him. Captain Marcus, a decorated veteran of 20 years of faithful service to the crown, stood with his sword hand hovering uncertainly over his weapon's hilt, but made absolutely no move to draw the blade. How could any reasonable man arrest an entire town? How could he possibly imprison his own neighbors, his own people, for standing up against what they clearly saw as fundamental injustice? The crowd instinctively sensed the guards' obvious hesitation and moral uncertainty, and their collective courage grew accordingly like a flame fed by fresh wind. More voices began joining the thunderous chorus of refusal, each person adding their individual voice to a growing symphony of righteous defiance that seemed to shake the very foundations of royal power. "Thomas speaks for absolutely all of us," shouted Robert the Miller with passionate conviction, white flour still dusting his work clothes from his morning's honest labor. "If you execute him for speaking truth, you execute the voice of every honest, hard-working person in this entire kingdom." His words carried the weight of a man who had spent his life feeding others, asking for nothing more than the right to survive. "We will never stand by and watch a truly good man die for the simple crime of speaking obvious truth," added Catherine the Weaver, her calloused hands clenched into determined fists at her sides, her voice carrying the strength of someone who had woven countless threads into fabric, just as the community was now weaving together in unity. The elderly priest slowly raised his weathered arms toward heaven, and an immediate, reverent hush fell over the entire crowd like a blessing from above. "Your Majesty," he said with the solemn authority that only decades of faithful service could provide, "there comes a sacred time in every ruler's reign when earthly law must humbly yield to divine justice. When human authority directly conflicts with God's eternal commandment to show mercy to the suffering, which path shall we choose?" Thomas, still kneeling with dignity by the blood-stained execution block, turned his head slowly to look directly at the king. There was no hatred burning in his honest eyes, no triumph at witnessing royal authority being challenged so boldly. Instead, there was something far more powerful and deeply unsettling to a tyrant's heart, genuine pity for a man who had lost his way. "Your Majesty," he said quietly, his voice carrying easily across the silent courtyard, "I want you to know that I bear you no personal ill will whatsoever. But a kingdom built entirely upon fear and oppression cannot stand forever against the tide of human dignity. Eventually, inevitably, people will choose love over terror, truth over comfortable lies, justice over convenient oppression. The massive executioner finally lowered his enormous axe completely, the heavy weapon suddenly feeling unbearably burdensome in his powerful hands. "I cannot do this terrible thing, Your Majesty," he said, his normally gruff voice barely above a whisper, trembling with emotion he had never before allowed himself to feel. "I have killed many men in service to the crown, but I have never been asked to kill hope itself, to murder compassion, to execute the very soul of human decency. That is what you truly ask of me today." The crowd began to surge forward, not with violence or threatening aggression, but with unified purpose and moral determination. Women of all ages knelt protectively beside Thomas, their presence creating a living shield of human compassion around him. Hard-working men stepped forward courageously to face the armed guards, not with weapons raised in anger, but with the quiet dignity of people who had finally discovered their collective moral courage. Young Timothy, barely 12 years old but possessed of extraordinary bravery, broke free from his terrified mother's protective grip and ran boldly to Thomas's side. "If you want to hurt him, you'll have to hurt all of us first," the boy declared with a fierce, uncomplicated bravery that only innocent children possess, his young voice ringing clear in the charged atmosphere. His mother initially tried desperately to pull him back to safety, but other children began following his courageous example, then their parents, then their grandparents, until Thomas was completely surrounded by an impenetrable wall of human compassion and solidarity that no royal decree could possibly penetrate or destroy. King Edmund found himself facing something completely unprecedented in the entire recorded history of royal authority: the united moral power of his own people, standing together fearlessly against what they collectively perceived as fundamental, inexcusable injustice. The very foundations of his reign were crumbling beneath his feet like a castle built on sand, and he could feel his absolute power evaporating like morning mist before the rising sun of popular awakening. The tense standoff stretched on endlessly, tension crackling through the morning air like electricity gathering before a devastating thunderstorm. King Edmund stood completely alone on his raised platform, isolated by his own power and increasingly distant from his people, while far below him hundreds upon hundreds of his subjects had created an impenetrable human fortress of protection around the condemned man. The bitter irony was not lost on anyone present in that ancient courtyard. The king had never appeared more powerless, more truly alone, than in this moment of what should have been his supreme authority. Queen Isabella, who had been watching the extraordinary scene unfold from a stone balcony high above, descended gracefully into the courtyard accompanied by her ladies-in-waiting, their silk gowns rustling softly against the stone steps. Her presence immediately commanded respectful attention throughout the crowd, for she was known and beloved throughout the entire kingdom for her grace, wisdom, and genuine compassion for the common people. The crowd parted respectfully as she approached the center of the conflict, but significantly, they did not disperse or retreat. "My beloved Lord Husband," she said carefully, her melodious voice carrying clearly in the hushed courtyard, "perhaps divine wisdom suggests we should reconsider this dangerous course of action before it leads us all to irreversible tragedy." Her words were diplomatically chosen yet unmistakably pointed. She had witnessed the remarkable transformation in the crowd's mood, understood perfectly the dangerous precedent being set, and recognized the potential for this situation to spiral completely beyond royal control. The king whirled on her with embarrassment and barely controlled rage. "You too would dare to undermine my royal authority? Would you have me appear weak and indecisive before all our subjects?" His voice cracked with the desperation of a man watching his world crumble around him. Queen Isabella met his furious gaze with steady courage and unwavering dignity. "I would have you appear just and merciful, my lord. True strength lies not in the crude ability to take life, but in the divine wisdom to preserve it when mercy serves the greater good of the kingdom." An old battle-scarred veteran, his weathered body bearing the permanent marks of countless battles fought in loyal service to the crown, stepped forward from the crowd and respectfully removed his dented helmet. "Your Majesty," he said solemnly, his voice heavy with years of faithful service and hard-earned wisdom, "I have fought courageously in 7 major wars for this kingdom, bled on foreign soil for your father's crown. I have seen with my own eyes what happens when rulers completely lose the love and respect of their people. No army in the world can protect a throne that sits upon the foundation of an entire nation's hatred. His powerful words carried special weight and undeniable authority, coming as they did from a man who had literally bled for the crown and earned his wisdom through suffering. Other veterans scattered throughout the crowd nodded their solemn agreement, their scarred faces grave with the kind of wisdom that can only be earned through witnessing the rise and fall of kingdoms. Suddenly, a small child broke free from the protective crowd and approached the throne with innocent fearlessness, holding something precious in her tiny hands. She was perhaps 5 years old, her simple clothes clearly patched and mended but scrupulously clean, her young face serious far beyond her tender years. The royal guards instinctively moved to intercept her, but the king raised his hand to stop them, curious despite his rage. "What is it, child?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper, somehow moved by her innocent courage. She held up a small piece of bread, no bigger than her small palm, obviously saved from her own meager meal. "My mama always says that when people are hungry, we should share what we have," she said with a simple wisdom that only children possess. "You look very sad, Your Majesty. Are you hungry too? Would you like to share my bread?" The completely innocent gesture broke something fundamental inside Edmund's chest, shattering the walls he had built around his heart. This small child, clearly from a family struggling desperately to survive the crushing poverty his policies had created, was offering to share her precious food with the very man who had caused her family's suffering. The pure, uncomplicated compassion of her act laid bare the complete moral bankruptcy of his position more effectively than any speech or sermon ever could. In that moment of profound revelation, watching this child offer love in response to cruelty, King Edmund finally understood what Thomas had been trying to tell him, what his people had been desperately trying to show him. True power came not from the ability to inspire fear, but from earning love and respect. Real authority flowed not from the threat of violence, but from moral leadership and just governance. The courtyard fell into absolute, sacred silence as the king stared at the small piece of bread in the child's outstretched hand. In that simple offering lay a lesson more powerful than any sermon, more profound than any philosophical treatise about governance. Here was the very essence of the community spirit that Thomas had lived and spoken of, the selfless compassion that made civilized society possible, the love that could overcome even the deepest hatred. Tears began to flow freely down Edmund's cheeks, surprising everyone present, including himself.